Hello everyone, welcome to this new roundtable, North-South, the same fight against major environmental disruption. I have the honor today to be with Mr. Darren Bergman, a member of the South African Parliament and also Shadow Minister of International Relations and Cooperation of South Africa. We also have Johannes Koskinen, member of the Finnish Parliament, Chairman of the Finance Committee, and also former minister. We also have Mrs. Anne Kratz, historian and senior fellow of the Open Diplomacy Institute, and also Maria Shin Abdullah, member of the Malaysian Parliament and human rights activist. So, for this great roundtable, we know that environmental degradation due to climate change has become a global concern. There is no scope for disputes over the impacts of the climate change on human species and the planet. The debate now is more on how to tackle these global threats when we have common but differentiated responsibilities. We all know that Global North has a huge responsibility in global warming and that still today northern countries don't show a great example every time. But the conventional narrative that Global South can wait and delay reductions in its efforts is very dangerous. Arguing about historic responsibilities from the North and ignoring current trends leads to ignore the need for swift transitions to decarbonization, both in the North and the South, especially in the highest countries of emissions. Internationally, this narrative is currently changing, and we see that great initiative is coming from North and South countries. Recently, the Chinese president, Xi, has announced at the UN General Assembly that its country will not more build new coal-fired projects power-based abroad. So I think we all agree that today, more than ever, we need to build a South-North cooperation to fight against the tragedies of climate change, and this is why we are all here today. So we're going to start by long exchanges with our speakers on around 40-45 minutes, and it will be after the time to have a time of question and answer with our audience. So my first question is for Mr. Johannes Koskinen. As I was saying, we know that today we have a common but differentiated responsibility concerning climate change, but how we can go beyond this belief to act all together in this fight? Mr. Koskinen.
This is a great question. We know that the burden of environmental falls most heavily on the poor and vulnerable, both in the world and in the societies and poor and vulnerable people. Wealthy countries export some of the impacts of their consumption and production to poorer nations through trade and waste disposal. They are kind of ultimate examples of that. But we know that these environmental risks, such as heat waves and flooding, drought, and pollution, hamper efforts to make cities and other human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable, and this is especially the case in the poorer countries. So we know that we should act together and to the same sustainable development goals, that the interconnected nature of climate change, loss of biodiversity, land degradation, and air and water pollution means they must be addressed together, both in North and South, to maximize the benefits and minimize trade-offs. The Paris Agreement and the process has been an example how to find this common good, the future of the globe, but we still require more ambitious national climate commitments, rapid transformations in areas including energy systems, land use, agriculture, forest protection, urban development. infrastructure and lifestyles also, especially in the north. And so we have kind of a different ways to tackle these problems, but we have the common goals, and we need more cooperations to finance the green change in especially developing countries, and there is maybe the most lacking will to find these common resources. The knowledge of these problems is getting better and better, both in the north and south. So we just have to find the right methods to have better results in our common work. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Koskinen. I want now to ask to Mrs. Maria Shin Abdullah quite the same question. We all say that we have a common responsibility in this fight, but the historical responsibility are not the same, and how this belief is perceived from the southern countries. Mrs. Shin Abdullah, your micro is out, so if you can activate it, please.
Oh, sorry. Can you just repeat this question again?
So we were just talking about the fact that there is a common but differentiated responsibility concerning climate change, and how this fact is perceived now from southern countries. How do they consider that they have to act also like the northern countries?
I feel that, thank you very much. I feel that it is not, the responsibility is both north and south. Simply because it's either reflected in the way we consume or the way we produce. So it's not just about the south being more responsible. And I feel that, we have to, at one point, have everyone sitting together and not, it's not just the government, but also the private sectors, the banks, the civil societies, international agencies, to see how we can actually resolve this gas emission, and also the destruction that's happening at the ecosystem. It's not just about the environment, but the ecosystem as well. And it takes a political will to actually do it. We have been talking about it for many years, for decades, that we will be reaching this level of gas emission, and so it's really, the time is now, because we have gone through, all of us have gone through the pandemic. We know what is the impact. We are actually still suffering some of the impact of the pandemic. And so therefore, we can actually build back better. And that build back better will have to include environmental and ecosystem solutions.
Thank you, Mrs. Maria Shin Abdullah. Now my question is for Mr. Darren Bergman. In the South country, we still speak about China. China is not a member of the G77 organization, but still has a form of leadership role. Can we still today consider that China is a spokesperson for the southern country? Does typically in South Africa, we can consider that China is a country from the south on this topic of climate change?
Well, I think it's a very good question. You've got to appreciate that China has a presence in the South, regardless of the fact that it is the biggest contributor in the Paris Agreement. It was recognized as one of the biggest contributors, and that it had made a plan for 2030 to eliminate a lot of what was deemed as one of the major contributors to the pollution in the south. But if you look in Africa, a lot of Africa, in terms of the current infrastructural investment, comes from China. So a lot of what's taking place in terms of dam building, mining, is actually, it's backed by China. And so China's definitely a big player in what happens in the south. And I think you disregard China at your own peril. And so wherever they stand in the G77 or wherever they stand in whatever forums they attend or not, I think we've seen with Trump, we've seen how important it is that a Paris Agreement locks a country into place and not necessarily a leader. Because I think when it comes to things such as agreements, in Africa, you might find that there's a change of events now where there's coups or leaders that are taking over that, if you had to look at a crystal ball 3 years ago or 10 years ago, you would never believe that these people would have been leaders in the next 5 or 10 years, and now they are the leaders. So I think at this stage you could say that the Paris Agreement would be much more beneficial being in the hands of countries, and that the leaders are tied to the pact by virtue of the fact that the country has signed it, and that the leaders are locked in by virtue of the countries that have signed it. I mean, you're looking at over 170 countries that have subscribed to something like the Paris Agreement. You would therefore want to ensure that that never again a president can come and rubbish or disclaim something as effective as the Paris Agreement, or take it back by ever many years. And so someone like China, the same thing, that's where they've had a plan and you're working towards a plan, let's say to 2030, that you don't derail such efforts less than a decade to go towards monitoring such a plan.
Thank you, Mr. Bergman. We have spoken about China, we have spoken about Africa, and now maybe we could switch to the US with Mrs. Anne Katz. Mrs. Anne Katz, the climate change policy of the US has obviously a major impact on global climate change and our willingness to mitigate it. How does the US perceive its own role for this challenge, for this common challenge? And after difficult years during the Trump presidency, what can we expect from the Biden administration on this?
Well, the Biden administration has made clear that it intends to fight climate change with all its might. It has doubled the amount of aid that it will provide to emerging countries to fight climate change, although it's a very small amount. To my mind, it's $11.4 billion, which is about 1.5% of the American defense budget. It is primarily concerned, it seems to me, and I personally regret it, and a number of people in the United States, activists, regret it as well. It seems primarily concerned in building back better, which to them means providing good paying jobs for Americans. And it means also exporting. I'm quoting President Biden saying, we can export our green technology across the globe. And I think there's a danger in that the climate change fight cannot become a savage economic competition. At least, I don't think this would help anybody. We all have to work together, as a number of your former speakers have said. And it is also very important, as my preceding speaker said, to take into account the various needs and various cultural procedures of other countries. The United States does not necessarily need to put itself in a leader's position at all costs, which is sometimes what it seems to want to do. President Biden repeats this ad nauseum: we have to lead, we have to lead, we have to lead. Well, if you want to talk about talk about the Americans as the US and China as the two major polluters in the world. If you think about the trade between those two countries, just in that one item, coal, recently China has bought from the United States about 1.1 million tons of coal for the first quarter, or excuse me, for the fourth quarter of 2020. This was an increase of 256% year on year in the import of coals from the United States. And it is true that China has recently announced that it would stop financing coal-fired plants abroad, but it will continue to finance new coal plants in China itself. So we have there a number of extremely important interests, not only economical, coal trade, also between China and Australia, of course, which used to supply 50% of Chinese coal imports. But we also have geopolitical interests, and we even have internal politics in the United States, because if you think of the coal-producing states in the US, namely West Virginia, to give the biggest example, that state is represented at the Senate by a Democratic senator, Senator Manchin, who is himself the owner of a number of stock from coal-producing companies, from which he gets lots of dividends, and he is also the head of the Senate Energy Commission. Therefore, he will be writing the energy part of Biden's climate change. So you can imagine that this will create a political conflict of primary importance to Biden, not only because of that in itself, because of the coal in itself, but because that region of West Virginia has voted for Trump 2 times in record numbers. So it is very important for Joe Biden to not antagonize the coal-producing states too much. So you see, there are those two things. Then, when you talk about building back better, it's also a great idea, but building back better in terms of infrastructure also implies using an enormous amount of cement, concrete, for roads, for other infrastructure, bridges, and so on and so forth. And producing cement is an extremely polluting operation. It also involves developing countries which sell their sand to the United States and other industrial countries in order to make cement with it. So there are lots of good intentions, but when you come down to looking at very concrete stuff, there is an emphasis, seemingly, especially on the part of the United States, on producing, and exporting. And this goes, to my mind, somewhat counter to the spirit of the climate change and greening of the economy reforms that have to be undertaken.
Thank you, Mrs. Kratz. Let's move now to Europe and with Mr. Johannes Koskinen. Can we consider that the European Union can create a green diplomacy? More than this, can we imagine that Europe can become a norm setter in ecological terms? Mr. Koskinen.
In certain aspects, we have done so. EU is a vast norm setter, and many European countries seem to be like an example how to proceed with green growth and these difficult changes. But of course, the European countries are in a better position than most developing countries with a high technology and the educational level of the society. So it's easier to find innovations and to also implement them. But the way Europe has done, we have not only EU legislation, but also Council of Europe has written tens of very important conventions which have been implemented to the member states' legislation and make life better in a bit maybe slower way than the EU legislation. If we think globally, so I think this method we have used in Europe could be a positive one, maybe in Asia or Africa. African Union has started in some branches with the same method, but not very widely. In Latin America, they have a same structure of societies and this kind of a common cooperation in constructing better infrastructure, better legislation could be a way to have a stronger development in very important fields of society. And of course, we also need global international law, which could make also easier to have an efficient green growth in the whole world. But it is maybe more difficult than this kind of regional cooperation to have a stronger development. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Koskinen. Now, Mr. Bergman, today, does the Paris Agreement really encourages emerging countries to take more responsibility in the ecological transition? How this agreement is perceived from South Africa? It is really a progress. It is really advancing all countries to go on ecological transition.
Look, I think it's important that we start off with communication. That I think we have to appreciate that how Europe and how America might communicate in their countries and how they bring that communication to Africa is quite different. I've been at conferences where and I've often made this point on international fora. I've been at conferences where a speaker will get up from the European Union and speak about Africa and the challenges in Africa and what's needed to be done in Africa. And they'll speak about climate change, they'll speak about the air quality, they'll speak about things like air pollution. The speakers from Africa will get up and speak about hunger, they'll speak about poverty, they'll speak about the Maslow hierarchies of needs in terms of the dire basic stuff, shelter, food. And we know that all of this is important. That if we don't get climate under control, we're going to have migration issues that will affect both North and South. We're going to have health issues that will affect both North and South. And of course, we're going to have food security issues that will affect both North and South. But if you're a delegate sitting from Africa in the same meeting, you must be thinking to yourself, I've just spoken my heart out about hunger, about how I'm dying, I'm suffering. And the colleague from Europe is more worried about my pet or my animal, in the sense that they're more worried about my pets not having enough good air quality or not having enough grazing. And often we see that the disconnect in the communication often causes that problem. Should we say that it's almost like a disillusionment, where one sits and says, well, I'm not being heard, and Europe might say, well, we're giving aid and we're not being heard, our aid's not going into the projects that we wanted it to go into. So there's a disconnect in the conversation. And I think if we had the buy-in from the beginning and we say, look, we don't care about the animals more than we care for humans, because I think we're all sentient beings, and if we protect each other, be it the plants, the animals, and human beings, we would protect the continent, we would protect the environment, and we would, protect our livelihoods. People would get jobs. The economy would start to thrive. What we need to have is that buy-in from the beginning, because dare I say it, that the green economy almost looks like a wealth issue. It almost becomes it's an America problem, or it's a Europe problem, because they're telling us that we can't be dirty, and they're telling us that we've got to clean up, but we can't. It's the same with the examples with COVID. When COVID happened now, and I mean, obviously we've been planning for years through the WHO that this situation would arise, and what would be our response when the situation did arise. But the first few months when the situation did arise, you didn't see countries running to help other countries in terms of PPE and in terms of trying to get medicines and aid out to those countries. Countries took responsibility for their own country to ensure their country first, which is not a criticism, it's an observation. But the internal observation was that whether you were rich, poor, black, white, round, square, whatever the case, male or female, you had to wear a mask, you had to sanitize, and you had to keep your social distance. Now, if you're a person that can't afford your own transport, you've got an issue. If you're a person that can't afford to buy your own mask, you have an issue. If you're a person that can't afford to purchase your own soap, you have an issue. So all these things have to be taken into account, that when you start talking greener energy, the greener the energy becomes, the more expensive it becomes. And so when we speak about the North and South issues, we're almost also talking about a class issue. And we have to also appreciate then that although the Paris Agreement holds developing countries and developed countries to the aid of the developing country, and that there will be monitoring and report back, it doesn't necessarily say that where that money goes, they will monitor that it is spent. So there has to be almost the buying has to start before the money even gets there. And I've often said in the talks of mine that it's not about aid. It's almost about the increase in trade. So, if we're looking at greener energy, why don't you get places like India and Africa to build the green energy, the solar energies or whatever it is, the plates, so that you can stimulate that economy. And then there's that buy-in coming in, because that's creating jobs. So this is the way in which we're going to stimulate, first of all, people's individual interest into the problem, but secondly, that the country gets invested into the issue, that there is a problem. There's no denying that there's a problem. The problem's going to affect everyone. It's not a problem that only affects certain people. It's not a problem that can decide which people it affects. It's going to affect everybody. And that when it does affect you, it's going to take away from, and we saw it again with COVID. COVID affected you, as I said, whether you're rich, poor, whether you're black or white, whether you're Christian, Muslim, or Jewish, whether you lived in France or whether you lived in London. COVID affected you. There was no way of avoiding COVID, and it was indiscriminate. So again, with climate change, the effects of climate change are the same. So from the North and the South, we're going to share the same problems. So now we have to share the same buy-in, and we have to share the same responsibilities. And I think that's the challenge, is using the same communication between North and South, that we both understand each other and we're both singing off the same song sheet from the beginning.
Thank you, Mr. Bergman. You raise a very good point by saying that we need to avoid the risk of disconnections in the conversation between the North and the South. Now, my question is for Mrs. Maria Shin Abdullah. How it is possible to establish international standards to fight the major environmental disruption to which both the North and the South have to respond? The micro is still out, apparently. Let's try again. Your micro, Mrs. Abdullah, is still out. Can you try to open it? Okay, so yes. Mrs. Shin Abdullah, I will come back to you as I can when your micro will be work. My question is now to Mr. Johannes Koskinen. Do you think that we can create a common market to set standards applicable to all countries? To what extent can we regulate the ecological transitions? How it is possible to build an institutional and law architecture in this field?
Well, the global legislation is a difficult task. In the history, we have had some examples of success stories like arms reduction. It's a difficult field, but with the long negotiations, there have been internationally applicable solutions. I think the more rapid ways to have solutions are in the fields of aid. There might be some conditionality and negotiations how to connect the green transition to the development that we want to have with all this international aid. I think the EU example of neighbourhood policies for this multi-year program now, which has started, is an example of that kind of cooperation. Unfortunately, COVID pandemic has shown that it's difficult to start these new policies when you can't travel, you don't have the normal situation in different countries. But also this COVID, of course, shows like Darren Bergman told that there has to be a common way of having this kind of pandemic situations handled at the same time in North and South, so that, for instance, the production of medicines, production of vaccines that starts at the same time and goes global, so that these patent and other legal hindrances won't stop that and won't make it slower than would be needed. But it's the same in climate policies, that when we find new solutions how to have solar energy with a decent price, so then we have to try to multiply the efforts to have it in the market with the right price in all the countries, and not coming slowly to the developing countries. So there has to be better financing tools. The development banks, the regional development World Bank and others would have to concentrate quite a lot in this green energy transition financing, for instance. And then the third field is trade policy, that there can be some conditionality, but also at the same time giving better chances for production in the developing countries to have market access in the richer parts of the globe, so that to make the playground more even and the level of playground so that it's more just and fair for companies in both rich and poor countries. So there may be ways to have parts of these solutions in the market, and kind of from different directions come to a more international common legal standards. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Koskinen. Maybe we can go back to Mrs. Mariashin Abdullah. Does your macro work now? Well, I don't. Okay, so let's move to our next question, and I want to ask Mrs. Anne Kras concerning the field of competition in ecological transition, because since the beginning, obviously, we are talking about cooperation, but do you think that ecological transition, green diplomacy could be also a field of competition, and especially in the rivalry between the US and China?
Well, yes, I think to some extent I've already touched upon this point early on, and it certainly will be part of the calculus of the Biden administration in the US. As the author some years ago of a book on the history of Franco-Russian trade from the 17th century to the 19th century, I'm particularly conscious, as it were, modestly so, of the advantages and disadvantages of trade. And the preceding speaker spoke about trade. And for example, talk again about coal, China, the US, and in this case, South Africa. South Africa has just sold, if I'm not mistaken, about 4.4 million tons of coal to China. Is anybody going to tell South Africa that they shouldn't sell coal to China because it contributes to the pollution in the world? You know, this cannot happen. And as the gentleman from South Africa said, the greening of the economy cannot just be a socio-economic program for rich countries. And in fact, a number of activists in the US and elsewhere are already complaining that the Biden plan, for example, pays attention only to emissions, reducing emissions. Well, we all want to reduce emissions, but in countries where there are no cars, it doesn't make too much sense to talk about reducing emissions, right? I mean, if you run around on bicycles on dirt roads, you don't emit much carbon dioxide. So to adopt rather, norms that would be suitable for the entire world just doesn't seem to be the right approach. And to pressure some countries into accepting norms that are not really appropriate for their lifestyle is not the right approach either. And then let me just say another thing. People all over the world are worried about their lifestyle. Many people are reluctant to change their lifestyles, even if they are conscious of climate change needs, and they are afraid that they will be imposed different lifestyles that they're not used to. And here we come to the great cultural divides that have to be bridged before we can really accomplish something that is worldwide. We have to have, and many of your speakers have said so throughout those 2.5 days of the RDDs, we have to talk to one another constantly, but we have to talk to one another on an equal basis and accept that some lifestyles are so important to some people, to some regions of the world, that they cannot and should not be changed under the pretext that they must conform to some worldwide standards that will green the entire economy.
Thank you, Mrs. Kras. I think now Mrs. Mariashin Abdullah is now with us. I would like to come back to my question to her. Mariashin Abdullah, do you think it is possible to establish international standards to fight the major environmental disruption to which both the South and the North can respond?
I think that, can you hear me now? Hello? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, it's perfect.
Yeah. I think that some of the speakers have actually answered it, that even though we may have standards set up and we have the Paris Agreement and a few others at the international level, but the problem with some of these international standards is that, like for example, the Paris Agreement, it doesn't really have uh, it doesn't really have that kind of a commitment or a pledge that is being made by the states, yeah, that you can actually hold them accountable to. So and it's the same with some of these international standards. They are really kind of free for all, but I think that most important is that those are just guidelines. Uh, how a country respond really have to depend on its own economy, its own people, and how it does trade with other countries. Because just take the example of oil palm. There's a lot of deforestation that's happening in some of the developing countries in response to growing oil palms. Of course, everyone criticized the countries for that, but at the same time, that industry actually provides the jobs for people, and it actually helps in many ways to grow the economy. So there has to be some kind of balance there, and there has to also, if other countries have got an alternative way of doing of harvesting the oil palm, or alternative products that they can actually share with developing countries, by all means do that. The sharing of data, the transfer of technology, which seldom happen, the transfer of technology at low and reasonable cost must be considered very seriously now, if we are going to work together to green the globally. The other one is really the sharing of resources has to also happen. I mean, financing has to happen, but it has to be at a level where one cannot impose, one's standard on another country. So there has to be some kind of negotiation, some kind of equal standing agreement to be made, so that it would be a win-win situation rather than an imposition. And when things go bad, it kind of thing. It has to be a whole approach whereby everyone gets involved at the table, and I'm talking about transnational. I'm talking about private sectors. I'm talking about the banks, state players, as well as civil society and the communities who are affected. They have to actually have a say in how standards, whether these standards set at the international level are really applicable to where they are. Because are we saying that we can't build roads, or are we saying that we can't build bridges? Because developing countries still need this infrastructure. So how is it that we can actually help to bring about an economy where or technology where you can actually help to reduce either gas emission or less unsustainable methods? That kind of sharing isn't quite there, or it comes with a high cost. So there's no transfer of technology, or partial transfer of technology that doesn't leave developing countries very sustainable. So the kind of relationship, when we say build back better, it has to be on terms that are more equal and equitable on both sides, or on all sides. And we have to start now. We really have to start now, because time is catching up. And this has been said many times over. And yet, very little is being done. I think that it really takes a lot of political will and leadership to actually push this sustainable development kind of approach forward, to make it more equal. It will mean a lot of understanding from all the state countries. But at the present moment, there is a trust deficit. There is a bit of reservations over what other countries or what this other country can do or cannot do. So that has to be tackled. And I feel that, if we don't do it now, we won't be able to, we will keep on talking about the green economy for the next several decades to come.
Thank you, Maria. I got the first question from our audience, and this is for Mr. Darren Bergman. Green economy is not synonymous, obviously, of clean economy, and especially when we have a look to the materials needed for ecological sector, numeric, and also stuff like this. And very often, we know that many of the minerals needed for the ecological transition are coming from Africa. Do you think that Africa could be a victim of this green economy, Mr. Darren Bergman?
This is a double-edged sword question. It's a very good question. There's a business economy that's thriving on the green economy, and it's aimed at the upper class in South Africa and the big businesses. If you look at it, there's even points awarded to it. It's a good way of collecting tax. But there's a good story as well. There's South Africa is going through a problem, and that's why my colleague in America at the moment with the coal going to China, the coal that's going to China, to make that story worse, is substandard coal. So that coal is probably even more hazardous than she actually realizes, because we've got a shortage of electricity where we actually on load shedding at the moment, because we cannot supply enough electricity. We cannot cope with the load that we already have because of our coal shortage, or what we call A-grade coal. So you can imagine the type of coal that's being shipped to China at this stage can only be substandard. So there's a need for people to live off the grid. And so the green energy, which again, is more expensive, which shouldn't be, is causing a lot of, there's a need for it, but there's going to be a backhanded problem with tax here, because when people go off the grid, when they finally get electricity coming from solar power, and their geysers are coming from solar power, and they get water from what we call in South Africa their JoJo tanks collected from the rain, they're not going to rely on government. So instead of paying rates for the municipality, and the municipality relying on our rates to provide services, where's the municipality going to get their money from? So what are you going to tax your individuals, your residents on? And so as we go along, for a long time now, our president didn't even want us to have another power provider. There was no competition to the current electricity supplier, and we weren't allowed another energy provider whatsoever. And that was to accommodate the likes of Russia and China, that obviously wanted to provide power to South Africa. And that they wanted to build stations for our power company called Eskom. Now you can imagine that if there's a blackout in South Africa, the quickest it would ever take in a complete blackout to generate power again would be 3 weeks. And if our system collapses, which being an old system and already not being able to generate enough power, not being able to already generate enough for the peak demand, we have to be very careful. Now, the fact that there's all these answers already, the fact that alternative energy exists and green energy exists, you would have assumed that the government of the day would have jumped at the opportunity now to allow for private service providers to come out and already allow for alternative service providers. And the fact that they, for 10 years, didn't do that until of late now, shows that there's a lot more money to be had in the green economy, and that there's a lot more that they were waiting for in behind the scenes in this green economy. So there's a lot that we don't know about in the front on green energy that's taking place in the back, that's ruining it for the environment because of politicians and not because of real concern, not because of Mother Nature, but because of greed. Thank you.
And, we have another question, this time for Mr. Koskinen. Taking into account the differences in resources and challenges for each country they have to face, how can we imagine a balanced effort between the different countries, how we can apply the same criteria to each one when we have to make a common effort for ecological transition? How can we make a common effort, but with very different standards between the countries, from the north, from the south, but also within north and within south?
I think the goals are the same, that we have to have a standard how to reduce emissions, how to avoid pollution and other things. So for instance, the development banks have discussed long about the standards or conditions of green bonds. In which cases can we have lower pricing for funding these green transition projects? And there, I think they have found the same methods, that even though the standard is a more expensive, gives more expensive solutions in the north, it can be also applicable in the south. When we give lower pricing, we have special arrangements how to connect international aid with the normal kind of a market price funding of the projects. And I think this is the idea also behind this EU neighborhood policies and some also American projects, that when we connect the kind of a private funding and public funding with this aid component, then we can find such solutions which are affordable also in the south. And when we have the kind of framework of Paris Agreement and other climate change agreements and others, so there we could have a better understanding which these common goals are and how much we have to have this aid component in different cases to have these projects also coming true, and they're just not just planning for the future, but they can be reached in quite a near future. And this work has to go on, and as we have noticed during the Paris Agreement, there was this pledge of $100 billion per year, which could be collected from private and public institutions. So it has not been reached, but anyhow, the level of this climate finance has come up from about 50 billion per year to about 80 billion per year. But this way have to be continued, and also that the developing countries are partners in these projects and not only as spectators when companies come from the north and have the financing package, and then they come into the market. But it's often better to have common companies, common partners from different parts, and so that then these projects can be localized in a way that they can't do any harm, like our South African colleague told about. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Koskinen. We have also another question from our audience. Most of the emissions are done by developed countries, and within these countries by a small part of the population. Northern countries should address in priority reduction of their consumption and carbon emission, while southern countries, developing countries, should put good basics, good practice for the future or ongoing sustainable development as a priority. Mrs. Kratz, our diplomacy can frankly address this difference in what has to be done, and could international institutions allow some green protectionism for this target?
Could international institutions allow green protection? I'm sure. Yeah. Well, the international institutions, the UN, is at the forefront of this whole greening of the world, and I'm not sure. Well, it's a very difficult question, because there isn't one single international institution that can handle it all. I mean, the UN is doing a lot, but each major country's own institutions have got to be in sync with the UN, as it were, if this whole thing is going to work. As we've all said over and over again, the North and the South and the West and the East are intricately linked in this whole thing, just as we all were with the COVID. And so we have to tackle it together. But at the same time, the difficulty remains always the same, that there cannot be, at least I don't think so, not in the near future anyway, an international rule that can be implemented systematically everywhere. But that doesn't mean that the international institutions shouldn't work on those rules, and indeed they already have, and for a long time. I mean, we're coming up to the COP26, which means the 26 years of discussions on this whole problem. So the problem is there are several countries in the world, namely, say, the United States, China, and perhaps Europe, that want to somehow or other seize the subject intellectually, and not just economically, but intellectually, and work on it sort of within their own circles. And I think that's where the problem lies. It's very difficult to come to norms that are suitable if there isn't an opening of the discussion circle that brings in, as the lady from Malaysia said, that brings in not only the cultural differences from the other countries concerned, but also the economic circumstances of the other countries concerned. As the gentleman from South Africa said, it often looks as if this whole thing is a class. It is not just a north-south thing. It's a rich versus poor problem. And this is, I think, where we have to work a little bit harder on establishing norms. And if there are any norms to be established, it will only be through a reinforcement of the UN, which is the only institution in a position to be impartial, shall we say.
Thank you, Mrs. Kraz. Our debate is coming to its end, and I would like a few words of conclusions from our different speakers. Maybe we can start with Mrs. Maria Shin Abdullah.
Thank you. I think that what is most important is that if we want to really initiate, is there an echo?
Yes, apparently.
Yeah, I don't know where is it coming from.
Maybe we can. You can reduce the sound of computer. Great.
Okay. Anyway, I think that initiating a green recovery would be a huge benefit, particularly for our region, the developing countries. Yeah, not only that it would help limit the global warming, but also to help us recover quicker from the pandemic, as well as to build an economy that is more resilient. But it has to be it I think that because the problem is so big, we need everyone to be on board. So it's not just about developing countries, do your job and try not to pollute the environment, but it is both ways. Yeah, that's the production and the consumption. So if we can change the patterns of production and consumption, perhaps we may be moving towards a much more resilient economy. And we have to put all our hearts and minds and expertise together so that we are able to not just tell countries, yeah, that they are violating the international standards or that they are polluting the environment, but to give them the solutions, yeah, that will lead to a much more sustainable economy. That's what the countries would need. No point saying that you can't grow oil palm, or you can't sell some of your logging and things like that, when that is the income from the countries. So we would have to think of much more sustainable products. And also it is also about a change of lifestyle, and that takes time. In Taiwan, it took them 30 years to change people's behavior towards how they look at garbage, how they should be recycling their garbage, so that they actually do a campaign to have less garbage going to landfill. It took them a period of 30 years, and it is not just so much about international standard there. It is really about looking at your garbage and deciding that well, from now on, I am going to actually reduce my garbage going to the landfill, and I will make the extra effort to actually separate all the garbage in different bags, so that I can actually recycle. And then the country will have to take the garbage that are being separated to actually produce it into products that are much more relevant to people's realities. So that actually takes time. And it takes a lot of resources as well. And I feel that, perhaps when funding are actually given, there has to be not so much an imposition on the countries who are taking or who are receiving the aid, but to actually come with technical support, so that you are able to gear it in such a way that it not only change behavior, but it also change how you deal with the environment, and how you can actually make it much more resilient, much more adaptable, and so then we can actually move forward together. I think that is what lawmakers, one of the role of the lawmakers should also be, because that is really a commitment, yeah, towards climate change. whether it is our role to push for more progressive legislation or oversee national budgets, or whether it's our mandate to voice the constituents, all these must really lead to a better understanding of why climate change, why our role in climate change becomes important. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Maria Shin Abdullah. Mr. Bergman, your conclusion of this debate.
Basically, as I've said, for me, it's really just a case of, it's not how we start, it's really how we end. And I think if we can get the communication right, and we can get the buy-in from the north, the south, the east, the west, and that we, as I said, we're singing all from the same song sheet, that's the start. The Paris Agreement is really in its infancy. If we take how long the world is and how long pollution's been around, we're still in its infancy, so we still got time, so to speak. The problem is economic stimulation, and I think this is where we have to get it right. We really have to do the simple basics right, and it's not about aid, it's really about trade. It's how to bring the developing countries up to developed status. You want developing countries to be able to police themselves. You want developing countries to be able to give you reliable reporting. You want developing countries to use technology that is efficient and that is not creating pollution, or that is not as pollution creative as what the developed countries use. Well, then you have to help us. And that's where I think the developed world, that was envisaged in the Paris Climate Agreement, was that the developed world would come in and they would give us monitoring of reports. They would make sure that the reports that were given from the developed countries were reliable, transparent, and that they were verified. So the only way that you're going to verify it, I would not rely on the UN as impartial, though. Please don't take that as a full criticism on the UN. I just believe that the UN has a propensity to sometimes be abused in politically, when what you need is an organization of scientists that behave like scientists and not like politicians. So what you would want them to do is take an objective look and say, well, these are the facts on the ground. This is what we're looking at, and this is what we report. No emotions, no biasness. It's pure hard fact and data. And then what you want are decision makers around the table to make a decision based on what they see, and to say, right, these countries need to be punished, these countries need to be rewarded, and these countries we need to assist going further. But there's going to be no cooperation in the Paris Agreement if out of 174 countries, you've only got 40 developed countries working together. Should we say the 2080 rule? You've got 20% of the countries pulling 80% of the world into a direction, but pulling that 80% kicking and screaming in a direction for the benefit of for the benefits of something that they can't see themselves. You want us to rather all be walking in that direction, so that we're not expanding or wasting energy. We're actually all working together in the same momentum, and we're conserving that energy. Thank you very much for having me. I've really enjoyed myself, and I hope I've made sense to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bergman. That was very interesting to have this conversation with you. Mr. Koskinen, your conclusion.
Well, thank you. My colleagues told quite good examples on the political will we need, and also the changes in attitudes in our everyday life which are needed. I might add some concrete proposals which should be supported. Firstly, this WHO One Health projects or program which is related to these pandemics and other health issues. So I think it should be very strongly supported all over the globe, and to make it real soon. Then I quote a few points from the UNEP program. I think these are quite easy to start implementing about how to transform economic and financial systems so that they lead and power the shift towards sustainability and the sustainable development goals. Promote and use natural capital accounting and inclusive wealth in decision making, including lending and grant making policies. Promote the internationalization of externalities in prices and a circular economy. Promote the elimination of environmentally harmful subsidies. Facilitate carbon trading, schemes for offsetting nature, and payments for ecosystem services. Develop environmental and social risk registers for all financial transactions. And to facilitate a major shift away from investments in environmentally unsustainable activities and toward economic activities that enhance the stock of natural assets. Fund the transition to a circular, green and low-carbon economy. Funding should flow to resilience, adaptation and just transition programs. And this is a message how we can start with the long and shorter steps, but anyway to the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Koskinen. And now the last words for Mrs. Anne Kratz.
Well, I think the garbage example given by the lady from Malaysia really seems to me to be absolutely right. It did take 30 years, she said, but it has taken the world, I dare say, by storm, so to speak. And there's hardly any country in the world today that does not encourage officially garbage sorting. So that seems to me, let's start with the garbage, and with that we would go very far. Otherwise, I find myself in agreement with everyone. And I think I hope they were in agreement with me as well, as we all say that we need to have the political will. This has been said over and over again, but it is absolutely indispensable. And I would just add one last thing. I think the financing of a sustainable economy has to be directed intellectually as well as physically towards people, and not just towards things that will make a better or greener economy. If people are not taken into account, it will not be accepted, and for it to succeed, it will have to be accepted. And I'll say one very last word about the those who doubt the impartiality of the UN. One can only agree with that person, in this case, the gentleman from South Africa, but I would also put into question his supposed impartiality of a group of scientists who would direct all of this, because we have seen that groups of scientists that have dealt with the COVID have been everything but impartial, if I'm not mistaken. And this will be my last word, but I would love to continue that conversation with the three other members of this panel. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Mrs. Kratz. Our debate is coming to its end now. I really would like to thank all our awesome panelists. That was a fascinating conversation this afternoon. And I think we all agree that dialogues is more than important between all our stakeholders in the fight against climate change, especially its impact. So thank you all. This is exactly what we are doing at the Open Diplomacy Institute. And now it's time to move from dialogue to actions. Thank you.